Hello, audience, and welcome to Investing in Psychedelics, Building Value Through IP. We are now entering our third and final session, Bankers and Capital Markets. This one is going to be, it's going to be a hoot. I know it. The characters that we have coming on are unbelievable. We actually sort of started talking before the session started. So without further ado, I'm going to maximize their talking time. The intros will be brief, and when I call your names, please appear. Audience, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A. Don't forget to subscribe to CSE TV on YouTube as well. Thank you to our sponsors, CFN Media, Frank Lane, and of course, Zuber, Lawler. And starting off with Zuber, Lawler, we have Josh Lawler, partner at Zuber, Lawler, Eric Weisblum, founder and CEO, Silo, Timothy Coe, founder, Entheon Biomedical, Ronan Levy, co-founder, Field Trip, and last but not least, the man, the myth, the legend, Richard Carleton, CEO of the Canadian Securities Exchange, and also the place where I work. So I'm turning it over to Josh, and take it away.
Thank you, Bear. Appreciate the intro. I'm very excited for this panel as well. We've had some discussions, and they've all been nice and spirited and exciting. So very quickly, my name is Josh Lawler. I'm a partner at the law firm Zuber, Lawler. We are in LA, New York, Chicago, Silicon Valley, Denver, and Phoenix. We focus on complex commercial transactions, mergers and acquisitions, finance, litigation, real estate, environmental. We have particular expertise within the fields of cannabis, blockchain, and psychedelic plant medicine as well.
We trade here in the U.S. on the OTCQB under the symbol SILO. I have 20 years experience of investing and working with private and public companies. I served on the board of a few biotech companies and consulted over the past 5-6 years.
Great, thank you. And Timothy, or Tim, I should say.
Oh, either or. No, thanks for having me. Timothy Coe, I'm the CEO of Entheon Biomedical. We're a clinical drug development company focused on the development of DMT for the purpose of treating addiction, but also in the generation of IP and technologies that will not only service that population, but potentially provide physicians with tools to make better informed prescriptive decisions.
Right, and Ronan?
Hi guys, my name is Ronan Levy. I'm executive chairman and one of the co-founders of Field Trip, traded on the CSE under FTRP. We are one of the global leaders in the end-to-end development of psychedelic therapies, from drug development with the novel molecule FT104, derived from a known psychedelic, to the actual delivery of psychedelic therapies with Field Trip Health locations, opening across North America and Europe, currently operating in Toronto, New York, LA, Chicago, and as of next week, Atlanta.
All right, and the man, the myth, the legend who needs no introduction. It's Richard, you want to...
Yeah, that's right. And to in fact introduce myself. Well, that is really a tough act to follow. But yes, as everybody has mentioned, I am the CEO of the Canadian Securities Exchange. We're particularly relevant in the psychedelic space because building on the leadership role that we develop in the cannabis industry, we have found that as entrepreneurs in the psychedelic space are looking for growth capital, are finding a lot of the usual doors closed to them and are turning to the public markets in order to raise that investment capital that they need to pursue the programs for their businesses. And like the cannabis folks that preceded them, they're finding that the Canadian Securities Exchange and the Canadian investment industry in general terms is well positioned to meet those needs. And at this point, we have more than 30 companies listed on the exchange that are pursuing some aspect of a business involving psychedelics. And of course, we're particularly pleased that Ronan and Tim are able to join us today, two outstanding examples of companies in the space. Eric, we'll have to have a chat at some point about broadening your access to the investment community through a Canadian listing, but we'll leave that for another day.
Look forward to it.
Fair enough. Well, I think Okay, great. Sorry, I've had some chat that we've had some technical difficulties, but it looks like it's on the listener side, not the broadcast side. So that's wonderful. I wanted to kind of set the stage here in terms of where we're currently at in psychedelics in the public markets, and that is with a veritable Cambrian explosion of companies coming on board. We did one of these panels at the beginning of the year, and it was a very different animal. There was, how is this different than cannabis was the question. And we all went, and it's very different than cannabis, but that was kind of the answer. But now we've got a lot of different variety and variation here. And from a capital markets perspective, the question becomes, who is the right company to be public? Who is the right company to invest in? What are the differences between them? And, how do people react to the various news, of which there seems to be some constantly? So, I'm going to start on that front. And I think there's been quite a bit of activity. Eric, you guys recently did a deal licensing your technology. You want to just chat about that a little bit?
Sure. I think some of the things we all have in common is overall anxiety, depression. We realize it's a problem that's touched all of our lives in one way or another. And a lot of the psychedelics have shown promising therapeutic and treatments for them. What our company has decided to do is to take a look more at some central nervous systems or rare neurological diseases and see if we can combine some traditional therapeutics along with psychedelics to help those. One of the things we did with our delivery system, with our CNS peptide, is we licensed the cancer rights to a NASDAQ-listed company who has a couple different drugs in the cancer space, and allowing them, with our cooperation, to further do some scientific research, how it could be helpful with various forms of cancer.
Understood. Thank you. And Tim, you guys also have been pretty busy lately. Take your pick of the recent deals. I think the Divergence one was the last one I saw. You want to explain that real fast?
Sure, yeah. So though we're committed to the clinical drug development pathway, I think the reality is that the realization of that story will take a good number of years. And so for us, our duty of care is ultimately to the patient that suffers from a life-changing psychiatric disorder. But one of the things that, that we seek to change is not only that eventual outcome with the utilization of our, hopefully approved drug product over time, but there exists a whole suite of difficulties that physicians face right now in terms of prescribing the right medicines. And ultimately, we exist in this era right now with psychedelics sort of in its infancy, but is there a pre-Cambrian explosion? I love that. It's a beautiful, poetic way to put it. Where more and more molecules will be coming online, and so as we get to that point of evolution, I think physicians need to be armed with more diagnostic tools that are needed to properly understand what the patient variability is going into any type of psychedelic endeavor. And so our focus, in addition to being a clinical drug development company, is developing a suite of tools. So from a genetics perspective, as well as a brain imaging perspective, give that real nuanced and personalized understanding about what that patient is going through so that they can better prescribe. I'm sure Ronan could speak to this, but very soon in that sort of therapeutic clinic space, there will be decisions to make in terms of, hey, someone has depression. What are the variables that go into prescribing, hey, will this person be better suited with ketamine or psilocybin? So we believe that genetics is a really strong feature of that sort of basis of information. And then EEG is one of the most researched areas of sort of brain study. And we believe that, we will develop out tools there. And so, stay tuned.
Right on. Wonderful. And connecting it, just Divergence being a company that particularly is in the EEG space and that you're working with in terms of biomarkers as they do their technical analysis. Wonderful. Ronan, that was actually a pretty good lead in for you as well in terms of clinical diagnostic and kind of the various different paths that that one can go in terms of application of psychedelics to the clinical issues. Sorry. Do you want to chat a little bit about that? And I'm not sure if you guys have done a deal in the last 3 days, the way the other ones have. Please, by all means.
Yeah, no, we haven't done a deal in the last few days. We're just focused on executing our existing strategy, which is building out the field trip health centers and advancing our work both on drug development and cultivation of psychedelic mushrooms. Looks like my camera's froze, but hopefully you can still hear me okay. Yeah, I mean, when I think about the emergence of this industry, there's definitely certain lessons to be taken from the cannabis industry. And now I'm purple on my end, but I apologize for that.
But yeah,
I'm having a psychedelic moment. When I think about this industry and where to look and how it's going to evolve, I think people really need to think ahead. What we're seeing right now is the lens of current paradigms to mental health, neuroscience, and drug development as they exist today. But what's really exciting and unique about the emergence of the psychedelics industry is that it takes a much more integrative approach to mental health and well-being. It recognizes that our mental health, depression, anxiety, PTSD, it's not just a function of chemicals in our brain going offside or haywire. It's a function of the emotional drivers, life, frankly. And so when you project into the future and think about what does this look like, that's where you get the real insights about who the important players are. This is not medicine that's going to be delivered in a family physician's office, with psychedelic experiences lasting from, as short as 20 minutes with 5-MeO DMT up to 10 hours with MDMA. New clinical infrastructure is going to be needed. Who's going to be delivering this care? Yes, it will be psychiatrists, but not exclusively. Where is it going to be delivered? New infrastructure required. What molecules? Certainly there's a lot of low-hanging fruit in terms of psilocybin, MDMA, DMT, all of those kind of things, but how do we make them better? How do we make them innovative? How do we create more impact and interplay that with the therapy underlying the whole experience? This is where I think the real opportunities and excitement lie. And there are certainly certain lenses and lessons that can be taken from the cannabis industry that I think are germane to the psychedelics industry, but I think they will be very different in the future.
Right. So I want to highlight those words "very different" because one of the things one might notice about the panel is that Ronan's back hopefully is that we have panelists that have very different types of companies in terms of their fields that they're focusing on in terms of both the medical problems they're trying to solve and the approaches. Richard, you get to see a lot of companies in the psychedelic space. Can you give a few words in terms of the variance that you're seeing, and possibly if you're seeing, things more frequently, some paths are more frequent, or in your mind more successful, there's more liquidity, there's more interest, any of those types of items?
Yeah, and I think Tim actually anticipated some of my remarks with the discussion of his business strategy, because on the one level, we can look at this as kind of a pure pharma play, where researchers are looking to develop specific compounds to treat specific health issues. And there's a very well-established path in the private equity and public markets for that to take place, right? We know how that works. We have startup juniors that research a compound, they go through preclinical trials, they do partnerships with big pharma as they show promising results, and they go through phase 1, 2, 3 of the clinical trials. But we also know, and the expression on Tim's face described it perfectly, that may take 12 years. It might take $15 billion to have a compound that's ultimately approved by Health Canada and the Food and Drug Administration in the United States. It's an enormous investment and slow, painstaking, as it should be. Although as we've seen with the COVID vaccine, it can go a little faster than that. So we see the entrepreneurial energy that's being brought to the table to try to advance not just the clinical research and the creation or the approval of specific compounds, but investigating all of the angles around the wellness potential for many of these substances, and understanding what the appropriate treatment modalities are. Because that's right, it's not Xanax in a number of pills that you take 2 a day or whatever it is. This has got to be an integrated therapeutic approach. At least that's what we seem to be looking at this point. And so it then begins to look a little different than the typical pharma way. So we see folks who are looking at the wellness component, where you have subpsychoactive portions of the compound included in a beverage or tablet or whatever. We also have folks that are looking at promoting a form of medical tourism, where you put clinics into jurisdictions where these compounds are not illegal, and you can offer courses of treatment for addiction, depression, anxiety, and so on, under medical supervision in different parts of the world. And of course, we do have companies that are pursuing more pure pharmaceutical type research, or some who are obviously a combination. Everybody is trying to obviously advance the knowledge, advance the understanding. And I think one of the fantastic things about this space, and this is, I don't know about very different from cannabis, but the body of historical clinical research that's been done on these compounds is in fact considerably bigger than that for cannabis. Mm-hmm. And if it wasn't for the war on drugs appearing sort of 1960-ish or thereabouts, we might actually be a lot farther along. So we know there's gold in the hills. We know that there will be successful approaches. I mean, not just the fact that people have been using some of these compounds for 5,000 years to raise consciousness, to deal with different human issues. So we will get to a better place with this industry. The key is always, of course, is identifying who the thought leaders and who the folks are going to be successfully execute the business plan.
Right on. And I should have said this at the beginning, this is not legal advice or investment advice as we talk about the psychedelic industry and how much white spaces has to go. Everyone should do their own diligence, of course. So what you didn't mention right there in the types of companies, which I think is really one of the main differentiators from cannabis, is you did not use the word recreational, which is very interesting. And, we noticed that none of our panelists here are focused on recreational uses. It's really much more emphasis on the medical and the alleviation of suffering in some particularly difficult conditions at times. Have you seen exceptions to that, Richard? Is there anybody that you're thinking of that has gone like, we're doing this as a rec type of endeavor?
Well, understand, for people to access the public markets, they have to be operating in accordance with applicable law. And I should have put air quotes around that. And the principles are essentially the same in Canada and in the United States. And although there is a move afoot in some local jurisdictions, municipalities in different parts of the United States, I don't think we're quite there yet in Canada. It's unlikely in the near term that we're going to see a company who can make that representation and warranty to an exchange or to a securities commission that they're operating in accordance with applicable law by offering or promoting adult recreational use of these compounds.
Gotcha. Interesting. I'm curious where the microdosing companies fit into that milieu, but we'll let that go for the moment. Eric, what you're doing with your company seems to be more focused towards the more traditional aspect that Richard was mentioning, as opposed to, the strict clinical setting or, treating, depression or addiction or any of those things that we meet. We were talking about cancer. In terms of kind of how you see your company and your public equity behaving, how do you think of yourself? Is it more along the lines of a psychedelic company? Is it more along the lines of a traditional medical, drug discovery company?
So it's actually, I would say it's a combination where it falls in between. We are focused on the pharmaceutical avenue where we don't necessarily believe it will be 100% in a clinical type setting. We believe it may be a combination of intervention. If you take a look at Parkinson's disease and some of these diseases, that it may play a role as a piece of intervention as far as a therapeutic. I had some Parkinson's cases that have touched my life, and I've spoken to a couple of doctors, and some of the symptoms of the tremors and some of it relates back to, the will to fight and depression. So I think that's where there really could be a tremendous opportunity for the psychedelics to play a role in addition to some of the traditional therapeutics. We are working with some well-known research universities, and we allow them basically, whether it's licensing their technology or partnering with them, to basically work hand in hand, sponsor the research, and develop the data that's needed to move the therapies along. And we look at all the data and all the other clinical research that's coming out and the positive results, and we take that into account, and we sort of analyze everything and all the data, and that's what's driving us towards the pharmaceutical model.
Gotcha. Tim, how do you see Entheon's approach in terms of, you maybe are in between the two in some ways?
Oh, I think what Ronan said was really pertinent, that this is not the old school pharma approach to, therapy, where we envision this molecule doing something on a pure synaptic or, chemical level, but rather it is this more holistic and sort of comprehensive approach that takes into consideration not just the mechanism of action on the brain, but also that sort of narrative and context building that ultimately does, get to a place of deeper understanding, both for the physician and the patient, about what that really intensely crucial milieu of emotional and psychological complexity is, that is often constitutes things like trauma or attachment, etc. Ultimately, it takes into consideration the full complexity of a person's entire life to that point. So for us, though we are primarily focused on the development of that pharmacological component, we understand that, like Ronan mentioned, there are a whole number of other considerations that come into play, like we talked about better understanding of a patient baseline, nuances within that patient, so genetic variances, things that will ultimately result in a safe administration of a drug, or even better understanding what the general psychological makeup of a person is based on what's sort of empirically trackable through sort of brain data or brain activity. And so for us, we understand that our duty of care ultimately is to the patient. And that patient engagement timeline can be months. It could take quite a long time. So we're trying to establish the appropriate tools and partnerships that are necessary to track, understand, and then ultimately report, the delivery of wellness over a longer period of time that traditional pharma is concerned with. So yeah, somewhere in the middle, of course, our core aims are there, but understanding that in order for us to provide the most effective treatment program, that it will take into consideration additional partners and sort of a longer timeline.
Gotcha. And when we say a longer timeline, are we comparing ourselves to traditional drug delivery and protocols, or is it kind of along those same lines? Because what you're describing does sound like, by the time you've got the drug to a point where you're comfortable with it, the dosage to a point where you're comfortable with it, you've run the studies, you've probably gone quite a while, especially, you're in addiction, so you're going to take a while to see what the results are.
Yeah, absolutely. What I meant by timeline is that patient journey timeline from, first diagnosis, the preparatory treatments to get them primed for psychedelic event, and then following that, ultimately wellness is a lifelong endeavor, right? We don't, come into epiphany and then without integration just live the remainder of our lives, perfectly well. It's this constant sort of nudging, tracking, amending how we sort of approach life. And so what I mean by that timeline is that structuring those infrastructure components, partnerships, and pieces of technology that could better support not just the drug intervention, but all the associated adjunct therapeutics.
Right. And again, a good lead into Ronan, and welcome back, sir. We're glad to see you again. So we've been discussing kind of parallels to the pharmaceutical industry pattern in terms of, getting your products approved and out, versus things that are a little bit more specific to the psychedelic sector in the way some would think of it, I guess, which is maybe more clinical than drug discovery in a lot of ways. Your company, I think, is doing both, basically. Do you want to chat about that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. And Timothy kind of touched on this. You'll hear in the conversation of psychedelics, the term set and setting, referring to the mindset that a person brings into the psychedelic therapy experience, as well as the physical location of it. So as important as all the dynamics that Timothy talked about in terms of understanding the brain and the genetic are going to have an impact on the evolution of this modality, and I think treatment of all mental health conditions, so too in the context of psychedelics are all the dynamics of set and setting, the music you listen to, the space in which the psychedelic experience takes place, the chairs, the lighting, the weather, all of these are dynamics that are going to have a significant impact on the outcome of the therapeutic outcomes, at least based on the historical evidence to date. And so as we were looking at how this industry emerged, there's a couple of key insights that we landed on. First was that if you're focusing on drug development without consideration of the set and setting, you're leaving an essential component, up to half of the therapeutic outcome, to chance or to third parties. And because they're so tightly knit, we felt that for our business model, we want to be both focused on the development of new drugs as well as the clinical administration. So we could create a virtuous cycle of taking the patient, the human level feedback and incorporating into what's needed in terms of the drug development. Because this is such a humanistic aspect of therapy and medicine, it felt incredibly important to have both aspects of it. It also de-risks our business model fundamentally, because we're able to generate revenues now, build a brand, build patient relationships, build referral relationships, and really kind of entrench ourselves in this emerging industry as we wait for the long time frames around drug developments that come through. And so with FT104, which is our drug, the lead in our drug development pipeline, we've also picked a strategy that we think can get us to market on an expeditious basis. Now, this is still probably 6 years away, but in the drug development timelines, it's relatively short. So it kind of creates a nice balance. But the other key insight we kind of stumbled upon, and this was, again, taking a lens from the cannabis industry, is we talked about there not being a recreational market, and I agree, there's not going to be a recreational market. We could get into the nuances of what recreational is defined as, but like the cannabis industry, what we're going to see is, in addition to a federal approvals for, we saw GW Pharma with Epidiolex, but then there's all the state cannabis licenses and programs, and we're seeing that happen already in psychedelics. That you have Compass Pathways, you have Field Trip, you have Entheon, you have Silent, you have all these companies pursuing a purely medical system, but at the same time, there's going to be a state by state and probably country by country rollout of access to the natural products, to mushrooms, in a therapeutic context, but not purely medical, meaning that there will be professional oversight. It will be delivered as a service, not a take-home product. And you'll have these two complementary systems operating. And so we've really designed Field Trip's model to be fluid, so we can participate in all aspects of this industry, because I think short term you'll have two moving forward, but then they'll start to converge where the lines get blurred, and I think we'll be situated to be really driving that conversation and that industry forward.
Right. So that's very interesting, because obviously, being public companies, we're all subject to financial reporting, which means somebody is in fact looking at the P&L and the balance sheets. Eric, you had mentioned ketamine yesterday as a possible area of focus, and that, of course, in the United States is something that there's a legality to. There are ketamine clinics, and Johnson & Johnson's got its product out there. Is that something that you would see as potentially viable? And I'm not sure if it would be for Silo or not, but what are your thoughts?
Well, so the question came up that it's not something that Silo is looking at or an interest, but I did pose the question that there has been a lot of positive research, especially for depression. And obviously, there's a lot of clinics that have been popping up. I think there's a couple of public companies that have been rolling up and expanding clinics. So I was actually asking the question, how come ketamine does not get the same exposure that psilocybin, or the excitement that psilocybin was? And I was asking some of my fellow panel members what just their opinion on ketamine was. But as far as Silo, we don't have any intentions or plans to focus on anything in the ketamine space.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think you guys all seem to have focused on particular molecules that you've got in your pipeline that you've kind of scanned out for particular purposes, and that seems to be the direction. Richard, one of the things that one can note if one looks closely at both cannabis and psychedelics is that the companies that are actually listed used to be, in many cases, in the natural resource mining space. Obviously, the endeavors of those companies in the natural resource mining space were successful enough that they are now no longer in that space, which is to say they weren't really very successful. We now have a bunch of companies that are popping up in the psychedelic space. I'm asking you to read the future. But what thoughts do you have in terms of what we look like in 5 years? Are these going to continue to be companies in the psychedelic space, or is the value of a shell going to remain and the next thing will come by?
I'm not sure where you're going with that, Josh. What we've seen with the psychedelic space in the early time frame is, in fact, a higher percentage or a much higher percentage of the companies went public by way of IPO, so that there were fewer reverse takeovers, reverse mergers, as you call them in the United States, that got these companies into the public markets. And that was something, to be honest, we encouraged somewhat, because there was a sense in the cannabis days that perhaps we'd gotten a little out in front of our securities regulators. And we knew that there were specific disclosure issues, not necessarily unique to the psychedelic industry, but we knew that there would be concerns around obviously the legal framework, the how they were going to conduct their businesses in accordance with the local laws. There needed to be opinions provided. Again, we learned some of this from the cannabis space, but having the first few companies into the markets go by way of prospectus made sure that all of the regulators were basically on the same page when it came to the issues that had to be addressed by the companies as they came into the markets. Yeah. And I think looking forward, I think we are going to see that some of these companies are successful with the immediate strategy of whether it's the clinics or some kind of managed care provision using psychedelic compounds in getting revenue at an earlier stage than a pure research company or drug discovery company would under the ordinary terms. Now, as I say, people who invest in those stories in the traditional drug discovery space, that's okay. It's the same as the junior mining space. They can go for years and they have no expectation of earning revenue. They're just trying to advance the knowledge, advance the project to the point where they attract the attention of a major, either a major mining company or big pharma, in order to actually commercialize the discoveries that they've made. So, as I say, that's a normal course type of investment that public company investors are used to. And, as I say, whether it's drugs or whether it's gold on the ground or whatever, I think there's an awful lot of similarities.
Very good. So that is interesting. And I always like being educated also. I hadn't realized that the initial public offering straight registration has been quite as popular. Would you say that things are going maybe a little bit more smoothly from a regulatory standpoint with the psychedelics than they did in the cannabis space?
Absolutely. And again, the experience that we gained in working with the cannabis industry in the early days was applied to working with our colleagues here and beyond. And it's been much, much smoother. Jeff Sessions hasn't threatened to show up on my front door with an arrest warrant. The Clearing and Settlement Organization hasn't threatened to stop clearing and settling the issues. And I don't get nervous calls from our board members wondering if, after, the U.S. authorities arrest me, that they're going to be going for them next.
Right. No, that's fantastic. And I think, I've certainly, noticed a lot of investment banker participation now. And, Canaccord is doing its thing and Haywood's doing its thing. And generally speaking, it seems to be a fairly well-oiled machine, actually.
Well, as I say, the not only, of course, do we have the cannabis learning, but drug discovery companies in the public markets are far from unknown. It's a very well understood path, and so that obviously helps as well. Got
it. So one of the things that I've noticed as a follower of the space is that we have a lot of news and announcements. They're frequent. I feel, even though I'm obviously not an insider to anybody, particularly anybody we don't represent, but there's a lot of discussion. For all three of you or whoever wants to answer, when you're doing that, obviously you've got a regulatory requirement, but are you focused on kind of the investing public, the retail investing public that's out there, or is it just kind of more just to announce for regulatory reasons?
I'll answer from the U.S. side. We just being fully compliant down here and listed on the U.S., we need to be full disclosure, transparent. So, we're required to basically disclose anything that we consider material event. And, we believe it's actually very good and it's transparent for our investors, that we want them to know that, we're here to build shareholder value, and want them to know what we're doing and be completely transparent.
Very good.
Absolutely. Yeah, just echoing that, of course, there's a materiality component where ultimately we're using funds, but there is also that sort of necessity to help articulate the evolving story that is our company, right? There's, with each partnership, acquisition, or endeavor, there is an associated, foundational building block upon which we will, whether it's developing a more near-term revenue opportunity or building the foundation of what will be an evolving, physician aid tool. We do need to, put this out there so that people understand how the narrative continues to develop. The reality is that there's always a balance to strike between what's materially important or necessary to disclose and how best to articulate this evolving value story. And for us, drug discovery being this long arc narrative, and we're working feverishly all the time. It is, sort of we're ducks on water where our feet are kicking, and it's a matter of being selective. We don't want to just get into the inside baseball stuff where it's just like, oh yeah, and some very, very, technically complicated thing is just something we put out there because it's Tuesday. We want to make sure that we get out real pertinent and valuable information.
Right. And actually the technically complicated, and I'll direct this one to Ronan, so it's a different question, but the technically complicated piece is one that I've been keeping in mind as well, because, if you're in the cannabis space, particularly if you got, a recreational consumer product or anything else of that nature, it's fairly easy, relatively speaking, to understand the company and what it does and, kind of what its path is. In the psychedelic space and big pharma in general, if you want to go in that direction, but I think even if you're not, if you're just in a clinical setting, the average person who may be looking, in the US at the OTC markets or in Canada at the Canadian Stock Exchange, probably doesn't have, the education. So, and Ronan, because I'm off to you, as you kind of carry out your business and make your announcements and things of that nature, is there any thought that goes into, I guess maybe the retail investor as opposed to just the regulatory, this is what I must do?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're fortunate, especially working with molecules that have a very, they have a long history both of recreational and sacramental use, and enough people have had experiences with psychedelics that when you talk about the development, it can speak to people in a very visceral way. They understand what it is, whereas no disrespect to Eric, a peptide doesn't mean much to many people, whereas LSD or psilocybin and evolution and improvements that does. So we're fortunate that the conversation that we're having, at least at this stage of the industry, I think is one that's not too hard to digest and is easily translatable into meaningful understanding for retail investors. For Field Trip, we're fortunate as well that part of our narrative is pretty Main Street in terms of opening up clinics. We are using ketamine-assisted therapy. We are treating people. We can show real results. So that certainly helps. I think at a certain point, maybe this industry evolves towards being too technically complicated, but for the foreseeable future, I think it's going to be driven on a level that the average retail investor can understand. And I think most companies have been fairly good at communicating the meaningful differences between their drug development efforts and others. So I think it's okay for now, but it's certainly going to be something to keep an eye on in the future.
Right. We have a question I want to get to before we're done, and I'm not entirely sure it fits with any of the business models of the panelists. But maybe Richard, you might be able to jump in also because it may fit somebody else's model. The question is: do you see a future for microdose food products as a consumer product outside of a clinical setting? Anybody who wants to tackle that is welcome to.
I definitely see it as a possibility, but as a food product, I don't think this gets regulated as a food product. I think that there's a potential for legal access to microdosing in the future in a model similar probably to cannabis, at least as we see in Canada and many of the US states. I think that's viable. I think there's a very real possibility that you're going to see a move towards regulatory change in Canada even before the clinical trials are completed in the US, specifically vis-a-vis psilocybin. And in that context, I think you're going to see a regime looking very much like the Canadian medical cannabis system coming. So yeah, there's a possibility, but I don't think that's most people's focus right now, because the evidence certainly supports large doses, transformational doses of psychedelics used with therapies, and the evidence around microdosing is still, to be determined.
Right. The nootropic studies haven't been conducted in quite the same way. Okay, great. So we are running short on time, so I'm going to run kind of a last and very basic question past everybody. So Eric, what would you say, without saying anything that would get you in trouble legally, to the investing public in terms of, somebody finds that they're interested in psychedelics, they see it's a very hot space, they may or may not be contrasting it to cannabis, and they just want to kind of get started and dig in. What would you say to that person as far as what they should do?
Well, as far as Silo, again, we're focusing on an area where a little bit different than pure anxiety and depression. We're going after, CNS disorders and seeing how they can play a role in helping people there, and that's what Silo's focus is on.
Mm-hmm. Tim, same question to the retail investor. Any words of wisdom?
There's a lot of companies out there. There's a lot to sift through as far as information. Silo's taking that traditional and psychedelic approach, serving on the board and helping and build some biotechnology companies. I want to ensure we can build shareholder value in that 3 and 5 years we're still here on this panel, and be able to show the progress that we've made about helping people as well as helping create shareholder value.
Wonderful. Yeah, Tim, same question about what you might say, or I should add, or perhaps maybe you're focusing more on the institutional investor, and that's really what you're looking at. Investors in general, how are you focusing on them, and any words of wisdom?
Yeah, no, I would just ask anyone that's sort of surveilling the landscape to look at what the focus of the company is. Does it exist under a plausible regulatory legislative framework? Is there a futurescape where their business model can legally exist? But also from the perspective of, are they addressing an otherwise unmet need? And I think, for, a lot of companies like Ronan's and mine, the traditional pharma model in terms of helping the populations that are sort of the target demographic of the companies is woefully sort of, the level of efficacies are woefully sort of low and sort of insignificant. And then also just to dive into the research. I know sometimes it gets into technical jargon, but if you do look at the transformational potential of some of these molecules and weigh that against what the current options are, see that the companies that you're potentially investing in, they have those two components where there is a transformational opportunity with whatever they're working on, and weigh that against what currently exists. Because I think, when you look at those two things combined, there's a case to be made for investing in companies like ours.
Wonderful. And I think you just made the case for Romans as well, but I'll ask the question as well. Thinking either retail or institutional investors, words of wisdom for the investing public.
Yeah, my words of wisdom are: spend some time thinking about how you see this industry evolving and what differentiates it from the conventional approaches to medicine. And you'll see the opportunities there. I do think that for the next, 6 months or year, it's going to be a situation of a rising tide floats all boats. And so I think there's going to be a lot of successful trades, at least for a retail investor. But long term, those who are focused on meeting the needs of the future, as opposed to trying to replicate a business model from the past, are going to be the ones that are well situated. I'd also offer up, try to do some digging into understanding patenting as well as data exclusivity, because with generic molecules like LSD, for example, it's not patentable. So you have to question how you make your money back if that can be genericized quickly when you have to spend hundreds of millions of dollars to get to approval. So those are the questions I think people should be asking. Institutionally, I think they'll do their digging pretty thoroughly in terms of the quality of the science. Yeah,
they're not going to take the panel's advice, most likely. Barrington is signaling that we're done, but Richard, any last thoughts or remarks?
I thought Barrington was actually here to save me, but I think there's no doubt, and I think all of the panelists are aware. We have seen retail investor enthusiasm for the space, and I'm afraid a lot of it was kind of like the early days of the cannabis space, where it was known as the yay weed trade, and now we've seen the yay mushrooms trade has certainly is working its way through the course of the markets. Again, as with the with our colleagues in the cannabis space, this is a question of eventually working with the institutions to broaden the range of shareholders that are participating in these stories. As a retail investor, I would look to see who is investing large sums in these companies by way of private placement. Are they educated, experienced, savvy investors in the health space, drug discovery space, and those are the people generally you want to be investing alongside. And that information is all publicly available. It's disclosed. And, those folks have certainly done their due diligence, and it's not a bad idea to be shoulder to shoulder with them.
Right. Well, if you say due diligence and public disclosure, you will get a wide smile from the lawyer. So you just got that. Thank you to all of our panelists and to the Canadian Stock Exchange for making this happen. And obviously to the various sponsors, one of which is my firm, Zuber Lawler. So I have to put that shameless plug in. Again, Zuber Lawler. Good. And Barrington, I'll leave it with you.
Thank you, because I don't feel any shame in plugging the Canadian Securities Exchange, Zuber Lawler, and CFN Media with Frank Lane. Thank you for making this possible. A thank you to our audience. Please do your research. Check out the companies on all three panels. If you need some lawyers, we know a couple organizations, one Zuber Lawler, the other one BLG. As well, I'd like to say thank you to people behind the scenes that are making this possible at the CSE, Grace Pedota and Neil Mall. Now, more shameless plugging. Check out CSE_TV. This will be available in replay form as well as on CFN Media. Also, don't forget to subscribe and also check out the upcoming series on plant proteins and health tech, digital health tech Thursdays and Tech Tuesdays. So with that, I would like to say thank you to everyone. Building value through IP. This has been another edition of Investing in Psychedelics. I've been your background host, Barrington Miller. Thank you and have a good day.
Thank you. Thanks.